All right, let's turn our attention to this now. There's been a new invigoration into the conversation around a basic income grant, right? This is a conversation that goes back to around the year 2000 when this idea of a basic income grant was first mooted. It's been debated over the last 20 or so years. Minister Lindiwe Zulu hinting that government could be looking at introducing a universal basic income grant at the end of the lockdown. This after the introduction of that 350 rand per month social relief of distress grant that has been introduced and paid to some beneficiaries. So how exactly do we afford a basic income grant, and how much would it be? Where would the money come from? Let's talk to accountant and activist Khaya Sithole, who joins us now to weigh in on this conversation. Khaya, let's start with the benefits of a basic income grant in this country with so much inequality and poverty. I doubt you will find anyone who would disagree that it would benefit a lot of people.
Yeah, I think, the merits of giving people something to be able to enable them to survive are indisputable. And of course, in a country where so many people quite simply do not have anything to get by, too many people do not have jobs or even access to economic opportunities, of course, it will make a significant impact on just their ability to navigate their way through their daily lives. And I suspect that in a country like ours, where perhaps so many structural issues really impede on people's ability to make it on their own, this will enable them to at least have a start. So a person who's even trying to apply for a job, we know there's costs associated with that. This might be just a great enabler that enables them to print that CV, to go and deliver that CV somewhere. So I do think that it is something that is definitely worth interrogating and worth exploring, and if possible, implementing.
Why is the age band 18 to 59 important?
So I think the importance of that age band is that we know that in South Africa, a lot of people actually do have some form of social assistance. So if you're born into poverty, then we know that you're going to get a child grant, for example. You'll be able to access basic healthcare for free. You'll be able to access basic education for free. So in that band, we already have a lot of people that have been catered for. What we've seen, however, being a problem is when people transition out of that social protection net and the question of where they end up. So, of course, if you are able to maybe transition into higher education, again, NSFAS might cover you. So that's one possible safety net that you might migrate into. But we do know, unfortunately, that far too many people in that band between the ages of 18 and 24 are lost in the system. They're out of the system because they're not in higher education. They're not in any form of formal employment or even training. So it's really those people that we now regard as quite vulnerable. So that's really what influences the conversation around the band of 18 to 59, but quite importantly, 18 to 24 being seen as a standalone band that requires some intervention. Stats SA keeps reminding us that we actually have millions of people that fall within that age bracket who actually aren't doing anything that is economically productive. So that's why that band is important. But of course, the reason we say 18 to 59 is that after the age of 59, you are moving into the pension age, which means you're already receiving a pension, which is a form of a social grant itself. So that's why the focus is on the band of 18 to 59.
But so having established, Khaya, that some kind of additional safety net, social safety net is needed and would benefit many people, the timing of having this conversation, we are talking at a time when, in terms of affordability and being able to implement it, many would say we are simply not there at the moment, given the state of our fiscus. You have suggested that the best way to do it would be resources that are currently not within our basket, so external. You use the example of Alaska, which pays from their oil resources and oil revenue, pays an annual dividend to people for merely being Alaskans. We don't have new oil reserves that have been discovered that can form the basis of that. Talk to me about the complexity of doing the mathematics and the accounting for that in a time when our fiscus is depleted.
Our great tragedy, of course, is that we're having this conversation at precisely the time where our state finances are at essentially record lows, where our capacity to even borrow additional finances have been compromised by the downgrades that we've seen, and really just the management of the national purse by the government in charge. So that's really the great tragedy that we're facing here. And of course, had this been an idea that was pursued way back when it was first put on the table in the late 90s and the early 2000s, perhaps the environment or perhaps the capacity for us to identify a particular income stream that could be used to finance a project of this nature could have been identified. And I think in the Alaska example, it was a very unique example in that the moment they discovered that, they had access to these huge oil reserves that were going to be a money spinner, they essentially took the step from day one to say a part of those revenues should be earmarked and should be ring-fenced to provide this permanent social security net for all their citizens. And of course, that was really just testimony to the visionary thinking of the people that were in charge of that state at that point in time, which was in 1977. I think in the South African context, unfortunately, far too many missed opportunities have now forced us to start having a conversation at precisely the one time where our capacity to even extract additional taxes from our existing tax base is severely compromised. We're talking at a time where we even heard yesterday that an additional 3 million people have actually joined this queue, this particular conversation, because if they're unable to get back onto their normal jobs, it would mean that they themselves are also then going to be added to the number that we're talking about when we say that we need some form of basic income grant. So it is a tragedy of timing where unfortunately we're having it at precisely the wrong time. But of course, the conversation is itself long overdue.
Yeah, and I mean, you're talking about a shrinking tax base, and we know about the under-collections year in, year out. We get the Minister of Finance reporting that actually we under-collected in terms of tax revenue from what we had expected to collect. Talk to me about the issue, because these measures are meant to address the one phenomenon that is poverty, but it's linked to inequality. So how important is it then that when we have this conversation more seriously and we're seeking to take it forward by way of policy, we talk about whether it should discriminate or it should not discriminate, this basic income grant, that if you are a South African, documented, undocumented, and I suppose also in terms of the what the courts have said, if you are a permanent resident in South Africa, you should simply get it simply because you are South African or a permanent resident and you are living and breathing, or should there be some criteria that would then talk to the inequalities we already have?
Yeah, so an important distinction between the Alaska case study and the South African case study is that the data in relation to Alaska actually indicated that having opened it up to absolutely everybody who's a citizen and they don't even ask whether you've got pre-existing wealth or not. What has then happened is that they've then ended up with the lowest levels of inequality across the United States. But that is essentially a function of them having had a similar starting point. So you didn't have pre-existing wide gaps between citizens that had means and citizens that didn't have means. So of course, if you have a much narrower band of inequality and you simply do implement a project of this nature, then you do not widen existing inequalities. And in fact, over time in Alaska, they have narrowed. I think in the South African context, unfortunately, we have a much huger disparity between the people who have something and the people who have nothing. So of course, then allocating a similar amount to absolutely every single citizen would only serve to entrench the pre-existing inequalities. And in fact, the people that start off with something will be better off, because for them, an additional 500 Rand or 1,000 Rand of an amount that they do not immediately need becomes invested in something else, and it actually then becomes much more than the 500 or the 1,000 Rand. While comparatively, the person who needs it will essentially use it all up. So a day later, you actually have the person who started off better being wealthier than the person who started off worse. So it would be undesirable in the South African context to have a universal approach that simply says everybody in the capacity as citizens, as permanent residents, or even refugees. So a discriminating system that is means tested would be more appropriate in the South African context if it is to be used as an instrument of trying to bridge the inequality gap that we know prevails.
Khaya, thank you so much for your insights there. That's this accountant, Khaya Sithole. They're weighing in on the debate about the basic income grant.